This is AI Governance with Dr. Freddie Seba, a podcast and practical guide to AI oversight for boards and executive leadership.
Welcome to another episode of AI Governance, where I spoke with a lot of practitioners in the past, and I'm very grateful that we have a couple lead practitioners of AI who has been doing this way before AI was sexy of anything. So this episode is all about evidence as AI governance. How do we go about turning clinical decision into accountable metrics? How do we measure this, especially in a mission critical environment as it is healthcare? So we're very fortunate, as I mentioned, we have Dr. Marc Overhage. He is an independent consultant now with a pretty long and extensive and amazing background. He is also an advisor of Motive Medical Intelligence, and I'm going to let them talk more about it. Marc is a former SVP of Health Informatics at Elevance Health, and he was a Chief Medical Informatics Officer at Cerner. So he can get more experience than that and more relevant to what we're going to talk about it. And Dr. Raajiv Ravi is a VP at in clinical innovation and physician engagement and Motive Medical Intelligence. He's also a former faculty too. So again, two physicians, very technical, a lot of hands-on experience in the show today. So again, welcome, and let me start. And I know I don't make justice to your background, so let me start with Marc. Marc, anything that you want our audience to know, and why should they be listening to our conversation?
I think first, thank you for the kind introduction. The arc, I've spent time in academia, time at EHR vendors, time at payers, and I'd say a commonality across all of that has been generating data that is useful. So interoperability, standardization, creating structured out of unstructured data, et cetera. But then applying clinical knowledge, clinical intelligence, if you will, to that data to get something useful done, whether it's decision support to physicians or to patients or to help guide business decisions. And that's really one of the places I first ran into Motive Medical Intelligence, even before that was their name. They've gone through some name changes over time. But have worked with the team at Motive for probably 15 years now across several different employers, trying to solve this problem of how do you leverage standardized computable clinical knowledge against standardized clinical data to deliver value. And so that's really been the journey, and I'm happy to continue that journey with all the other folks out there trying to get something productive done, not just play with the latest bright shiny object, but actually deliver value, whether that's through AI that is simple rule-based systems, or through machine learning, or through generative technologies or agents. And we'll get into that more as we get into the conversation, I'm sure.
Excellent. Thank you for that context. Same question for you, Raajiv.
Well, thank you, Freddie. It's great to be here, first of all, and it's a real pleasure to be a part of the conversation with you and Marc. Raajiv Ravi, as you said, VP of Clinical Innovation and Engagement. But the most important part is Marc and I share the physician informatician, where Marc has been shaping this field for quite some time, and he's been helping build much of the foundation that people like me have the privilege to build upon. And what you just heard Marc talk about is an important, an architectural view that he's been working on. And then what my work comes into picture is to put that architecture, that design into practice. And so my work sits at the intersection of medicine, data, and physician engagement. So it has two sides of the spectrum. On one end, like Mark, we are also looking at clinical knowledge and transforming that into computable logic. And on the other end, we are looking at what happens when you deploy that logic. After that, like it's the human side of the healthcare analytics, where we are working with physicians to understand the physician practice variation, and we are engaging with clinicians in ways that are meaningful and that we can help move the needle in the physician behavior and also help operationalize the value-based care, right? So and then we see that at both ends of the spectrum, there is AI involved. And when we talk about AI being involved in both ends of the spectrum, then, it also becomes a huge risk if there is no governance involved as part of it as well. So that's primarily the focus areas that I'm working on right now.
Great. I don't want to put a plug for you, but why would somebody want to talk to you now as opposed to, we usually talk about the, build versus buy. So you guys have been at this for a long time. You are both physician informatics. So why would somebody in the audience say, yep, these are the guys that I should be reaching out?
Mark, you want to go first?
Sure. Well, and I think you need to reach out to many people because there's a lot, as you say, going on, and a lot of learning and exploration happening. But I think one of the things that I've always appreciated about the approach that Motive Medical takes to these kind of problems, and that I try to take, is number one is being rigorous from a intellectual standpoint. What is the literature telling us? How do we systematically evaluate? How do we thoughtfully decide where and when each kind of artificial intelligence technique is relevant? So I think that kind of disciplined exploration is one of the reasons that the work that Motive does has always been so attractive to me. But I think the second thing is, and Raajiv was just talking about this, is that we're both hands-on in a lot of ways. I'm just finishing up a paper submitting to New England Journal of Medicine AI about agentic care management platform that I built and evaluated. And you learn not just about the technology, but you get into some deep questions about how do you evaluate these things. Big question in a lot of discussion groups today. So that'd be the second thing I think is the hands-on dive in and really play with, if you will, evaluate, touch, and feel the technology to understand its limitations and where it's got strengths and opportunities. So I think those are the two things that make us a good pair for you to have a conversation with.
Excellent.
And just to add on to it, so maybe also a little bit more about the organization at Motive Medical Intelligence. Just what Mark was touching base on is the work that we do, encompasses the clinical evidence to deployed logic to the physician engagement, but ultimately to a value-based care. So that is primarily the mission of Motive Medical Intelligence, right? Like we help organizations take the knowledge and translate that into systems and insights, and eventually improve, focus on care delivery. So and we do that via two broad connecting bodies. The first is a program called as the Practicing Wisely program, where we analyze large healthcare data sets to identify patterns in variation in physician performance across 20 specialties. So this helps health plans and health systems understand where either care is overused or underutilized or is inconsistent with clinical evidence. And then eventually making sure that we can have meaningful conversations with them to move the needle in the value-based care. The other and the other body of work that we do, which kind of closely aligns to what Mark was talking about earlier, is the heavy lift, which we call as the knowledge interoperability, where we are working on tons of clinical evidence and converting them into computable knowledge. And one of the things that that people see that they do need to come to us and talk to us about is because of that challenges that are involved and the complexities that are involved in converting that computable knowledge into like a clinical evidence into computable knowledge. At the surface, it might look pretty simple, but it involves a lot of rigorous collaborative work across, clinicians, designers, data science teams, and all that. And it's not a simple thing to scale, and which is why people, reach out to us.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And I mean, I guess you answered two of my next questions, which is what you're spending time on. So, Mark, you're spending, I mean, that paper sounds fascinating, and, I look forward to reading it. I consume a lot of those documents. So, we have, I mean, you are basically working and writing and researching what is pretty problematic or pretty challenging, I should say, on the governance side. When I hear at Raajiv, he's thinking ML, which is, we've been familiar, that thing's not going to go crazy, it's not going to be a hallucination. So can you help us, our audience, understand of the extra challenges of this new type of AI, generative AI, embodied AI, agentic AI, and what's the sense of urgency that leaders and boards should really be aware of what's going on out there?
On so many things we could talk about there. I think first is, and Raajiv, feel free to disagree with this, but as usual, it's not the technology that's the limiting factor here. It's just incredible what researchers, the developers of frontier models, developers of frameworks for agentic models, incredible what's out there and the potential that exists. Where I think we fall down, as usual, is in implementation. I mean, I think that there are hidden issues, and when I say hidden issues, not thought about issues, if you will, with the technology, like cost. Just as a concrete example, in some naive work, I'd say that we did at Elevance, initially extracting the data we needed from a patient record for care management, throw it at the LLM, tell it what you want, and it didn't do a half bad job at $45 in cost. Holy cow. I mean, it was really, and we were doing hundreds of thousands, millions of patient support. It's real money. And so I think cost is a good example of where, and there's several issues around that, where people are not thinking hard enough yet. As they get to deployment, though, it becomes a reality that they really have to think about. And the flip side of that being, of course, that the AI companies, with their investment capitalization, if they don't get those kind of return, they're going to have a hard time supporting their value proposition going forward. But I think once you get beyond sort of the technology and its cost and security and privacy sorts of things that are pretty well documented, even hallucinations, I think, is a more or less soluble problem. You've got to be on guard. You have to deal with it, but it's not a deal breaker for many applications. There are probably some where it is. But where I think management and the governance issues you really start getting stuck are things like the proliferation of pilots. There are companies with hundreds of pilots going on, and you could argue, fantastic, letting 1,000 flowers bloom, innovation. But then the question is, do they have the skills, the processes, the organization in place to harvest those that are valuable, scale them, and derive the value from them? Probably not. I mean, that's rare to find. You also have issues like I like to call it process reengineering debt. We've often architected and designed and staffed our organizations for a particular model of doing things. Well, so now I automate this portion of something, and so that happens instantly instead of taking 2 weeks and being in a queue. What about all the downstream steps? Do I have enough capacity to deal with those? Do I have a way to capture the productivity benefit, let's say let's say I truly do get a 12% increase in employee productivity, is there a way I can actually reduce my costs by 12%? Very hard to do organizationally, especially if you've not really addressed the process re-engineering problem. And then, and then I mean, like I said, there's many things I think we can go on to, but the other, I think, is, the ongoing evolution of these creatures, of the technologies, of agents, and of capabilities. It's not a static deployment. And, we learned this lesson with machine learned models and their degradation or drift over time. We have similar things with LLMs and agentic systems in terms of they're not deterministic. They don't perform at the same level next week as they did last week for a whole variety of reasons. Additional data available, they may mask problems. If you've got deterministic logic that says, okay, take the latest expense and deal with it, it goes, wait a minute, I don't have that. The agent says, let's figure out how to work around that. And maybe it doesn't perform as well, and you don't even know you have a problem. So I think those are some of the top things that come to mind for me for governance, in addition to all the things that we think about with the technology and demonstrating the performance of those of the systems themselves and monitoring. But in operations, I think it becomes a lot more complex.
Thank you, Marc. You gave us a lot to chew. Raajiv?
Yeah, I mean, just to add on to the hallucination part and all the other things that Marc was just touching upon, I think it's also important to understand, where does the clinical knowledge infrastructure, status is? Like, is that ready? Like, in terms of many of the initiatives in healthcare today, they struggle because, or not because of the models and the maturity of the models or their inadequacy, but it's because of the clinical knowledge that those models depend on. They're still in unstructured form, and to have that knowledge data structure layer ready and available is important. And one of the things that many organizations struggle with is they just find out these small components or areas where they can go and immediately get a win in terms of employing something, seeing some productivity. But I feel that there has to be a larger vision in terms of how can we make the clinical knowledge layer stable, trustworthy, validated, because that's the layer on top of which intelligence is going to be built on, or the layer on top of which AI is going to sit. And only after that, we can really bring in governance to that layer. So I think that readiness is something that leaders have to see holistically. And that's the part I feel like, a lot of struggle is at this point.
Thank you, Raajiv.
And
So, sorry, go ahead, Marc.
just one other thing to add to that, because Raajiv, you triggered a real thought for me, which is I think one of the other issues in governance that becomes very important is the technology part of the organization is often enamored with the technology and its growth and its progress and its evolution. And it is incredibly tempting for them to chase the next bright, shiny object. This foundation model is now performing better. This new platform lets us do some cool things that we couldn't do before. And they're going to want to do that. Mm-hmm. And the business side of the enterprise needs to be very thoughtful about what is the incremental value. Can we deploy the old, less flashy, less cool technology and actually get some value from it today before we run off and chase the next thing? I think this relates to kind of the pilot comment I made before of you don't even get a full pilot and evaluation completed because the field's moving so fast. There's a better way to do it. And the temptation is to try the better way to do it. Maybe it's better, maybe it's cheaper, maybe it's faster, but then you never get to the point where you're actually deriving the value from all of that work.
Thank you, Marc. So how do I go? I mean, what if I'm a leader and I'm a board member listening to this conversation? I'm like saying, "Oh my God, how do I go about dealing with that? Do I just wait and see how things sort out and then jump in, or how does this fit within the strategy of my organization?"
Raajiv, you want to start, or do you want me to?
Sure. Yeah, I think it goes back to that you know um, architecture that we're talking about, where we are looking at it in a more disciplined way about AI, right? So we start with the task and evaluating the requirements, and then choosing the right method. I think that's an architecture layer that Marc talks about in his white paper that is about to publish. And I think that's a part that I feel all leadership teams to start with, and then ask the question on top of it is, what are all the areas where the infrastructure is ready, and then start to slowly implement the AI models in those areas. So from a strategic conversation, what often you need to start to look at the clinical knowledge pipeline itself. Organizations have to then take a look at the long-term vision, and then look at how we can take those computable representations and then grow. And then that's on one end, and then slowly start to also see what are all the other different areas where we can then bring AI as a holistic solution. And I think I think that's a key aspect of when you look at leaders and asking the question, where do I bring AI immediately? I think the question is a larger vision problem in terms of how the product strategy is looking at.
Thank you, Marc.
And I think as a board member, senior leader, and obviously depends somewhat on the scale of your organization, how close to the day-to-day things you are versus, but I think in general, it's like it is not anything markedly different than any other strategic, and this is truly a strategic initiative. You have to be incredibly clear about the objectives of what you're trying to accomplish. Are you really trying to drive costs down? Are you trying to enable things that you couldn't do before? It's not just doing it to do it. It's not just doing it so you can answer the question at your stockholder meeting when they inevitably ask, what are you doing about AI? I think a very fair answer, I can't think of a good example of this, but I could imagine out there's an organization that says, we're not doing anything about AI because it just doesn't make sense for us. I think that there are pockets and areas of every organization, but I think that's the first thing is it's like any other strategic initiative, you have to be incredibly clear about what are you hoping to get out of it, and what the metrics that are going to enable you to know if you got that out of it. You have some additional worries, though. Risk is higher, both because of the technology is moving fast, it's unproven. Some of the issues that you talked about of hallucination, will it perform? A new set of risks, so you have to be more vigilant about risk than perhaps you were in other strategic, because it's less known territory. And then I think the third thing, and I'll probably end up just whipping this topic repeatedly, is the technology is going to be the easiest part. And so change management, the initial thing everybody's going to go, oh, is it a on-site LLM, and is our data leaving our firewall, and all these technical things that people are going to get very anxious about. What is going to be the failure point is deployment, the last mile. How do we actually get value out of it? We created this ability to summarize the patient record. How do we actually get value out of it? How do we deliver it to the care manager or the physician so that do they actually need it? Do they actually need a summary, or do they really just need two important questions answered? Those kind of deployment issues. And so this is classic implementation science in the healthcare area, in business change, transformation, both leadership and process management. Those are the areas that I think the senior level leadership need to be, they're going to have hired smart IT people, or they're going to have a great contractor, or they're going to have a chosen and licensed a third party product. Getting it to deliver value in the business is going to be far and away the hardest part. And making sure that the discipline around doing that, that the right people, that you realize, in the old days, we used to talk about if you spend a $10 on the computer, you'd spend $1 on the software, and it became $1 on the computer and $10 on the software. And now it's a penny on the system and the software, and you better be planning $100 to do the implementation and change management that you need to get the value out of it.
Thank you. Great points. So how do we factor? So I'm hearing loud and clear organizational management, of course, the investment. I heard you talk in the past about cybersecurity, about all the risk of having all these electronic medical records suddenly available, concentrated in one place. So can you guys talk about how do governance, control, assurance, accountability factor into those decisions too? I mean, let's say I feel comfortable as a senior leader that, yeah, my team is ready to embrace it. Yep, I figure out a ROI, a way to measure it, and everybody's on board because hopefully we're going to remove some of the friction out of a workflow. And let's assume, and this is a big assumption, that people who are going to be doing the work are eager to do the work. That, we're going to keep a human in the loop, that they're going to keep, agency. So how about these other factors that leaders should think about it? How do they go about it?
So one of the things that I would say is, so when you touch base on, right, like how leaders go about identifying some areas where they could bring about AI. And so it's kind of like a hybrid model, like in many of the areas. So like at least in the ones that we are deploying today, a few examples are we are looking at evidence, and we are seeing that all these evidence has to be updated on an ongoing basis. So they change, the evidence evolves quite a bit, and so we are seeing specialty society guidelines and recommendations, coverage policies from the payers. All those are updated on a consistent basis, and so we have to see what is the way that we can deploy some parts of AI that can, maybe summarize, bring about those updates in a certain way. And then how can we employ some parts of deterministic logic in terms of making sure that there is a process to catch anything that goes unvalidated, right? So it's that mix of trying to make sure that nothing goes out of the pipeline without validation is going to be a key framework for people to think about when they are making sure that it is safe, secure, and it's validated, right? But there are some parts where you can just deploy some deterministic logic in place that can do that for us. But there are some times where you just have to have human in the loop, but there's no other way. So you do have parts where it is Gen AI assistive layer at the start, but then there is a human in the loop who is doing the QCs and stuff like that, right? So we do have a few examples where we are seeing real value that AI could bring, but it's at the end of the day, it's up to us to decide how that model evolves, how that hybrid model evolves. And so at this point, I don't see the maturity enough to have just AI just do an end-to-end and then leave the rest for people to just take on, right?
And if I can go back to your Freddie, I think you were going at the issue of privacy security a bit with these systems, and I don't think that AI really changes the risk profile from that standpoint over what we've been doing for 20 years. And the reason I say that is what a lot of people think about is training of models, right? We're going to throw all this data in and who's got control. And that you have to be worried about. most organizations should not be doing that.
Mhm.
I mean, if they do, they should be doing it very eyes wide open and selectively. Um, but so what they're going to be doing is using that model. So let's say the example Raajiv used of some image analysis, machine learned image analysis capability. You still have to be careful, but you're not handing it 10 million radiographs.
Mm.
You're taking the one radiograph that was just done for Mrs. Jones and running it through the algorithm and getting the result. And there's no reason that you have to be thoughtful in your data agreements with, if it's a third party, that they're not allowed to keep that and use it for subsequent training or whatever, just as you would in any other scenario. But again, the risks aren't any different than they've been for 20 years.
Mm.
I don't believe. On the sense of using it, where it is probably different, and this is a whole different thread. I don't think this is that the sophistication of the cyber attacks that can be mounted and the approaches to phishing that can be leveraged are now incredibly more sophisticated than they were, and they're going to continue to be more sophisticated. Even biometric, security and things is being challenged by deep fakes and the ability to, and viable quantum computing. There's definitely risk, but it's not because there's more concentrated data or whatever. But I think, as usual, it's going to be the social engineering attack, which are increasingly sophisticated and scalable as a result of AI. One example that I saw not long ago was a group who was able to essentially in real time create the user interface that exactly mirrored the user interface of the company's login screens and Apple, because it was basically looking at it as it did it, putting it up for the user. They intercepted monkey in the middle. The user would type in their password and they would then enter the password into the real system, but they would have the password and then hand the user off. I mean, just incredible, enabled by the ability for the AI to be looking at dynamically the screen, recreating the interface on the fly, and delivering it with validations and all sorts of things to the point the user didn't know they weren't using their native system.
Wow. That's
And so I
incredible.
think that's, certainly an AI, but that's sort of a distinct thing from concentrated data or using the AI or whatever. But a whole host of risks that we're going to have to worry about, as I say, that are different than they used to be.
Thank you. Raajiv?
Well, I guess in terms of security aspects, like I mean, we constantly see, even with applications that we are constantly working on, and then just passing on like the insights that we provide to clients. There is a lot of places where we are finding ways that systems can be tricked, and we can just let our insights go haywire. So those are parts that we constantly look at, trying to bring some kind of guardrails, putting together, making sure that systems just don't go reach out and get the information that they need. And yeah, just hitting on what Marc said is, the more sophistication that we are seeing with AI systems, the more leaders have to be thoughtful about where they are deploying those AI solutions.
Thank you, guys. So, Marc and Raajiv, I'm hearing, look, the risk has been there before AI. There is additional risk because the technology is pretty sophisticated. So, what type of early warnings should leadership be into the lookup? I mean, quality drift, incidents, misuse, complaints, audit friction. How should they think about it with this extra layer of complexity that you're bringing up?
Mark, do you want to take that?
That's a tough question. I think I think one way to think about that is that this is part of the expense. With this increased power and potential comes additional expense. And so as you factor in the value created, you have to plan for that greater amount of monitoring and oversight. The governance, like you say, and there's governance at multiple levels, but even just focusing on the governance of the models and their performance itself, we're not used to that kind of DevOps kind of behavior. So that's a cost that we need to factor into the economic assessment of these opportunities. And especially, I think of these as power tools. When they go wrong, they can go very wrong. You don't just cut your finger, you cut all four fingers off because they're so powerful. And so there's and that's always something hard for organizations to deal with. It's a catastrophic risk if it happens, but it's not real likely to happen. But the size of it, the catastrophe is gigantic if it happens with these things. So I think that's one thing. And so the investment, as you suggest, in the monitoring processes and the monitoring systems is just not something you can skip. But other than that, I think, as Raajiv said earlier, and this is a real challenge too, is trying for critical processes to have a human in the loop. But this gets back to the sort of informatics basics of the 1980s of if a system performs really well, and if 90% of the things it suggests are right, and another 5 or 7% might be right, if it's wrong only a small proportion of the time, the human quickly goes, yep, must be right. And how do you keep critical, valid human oversight? And so I think that we have to, a second thing we have to do is think about risk-based approaches. Depending on how risky what we're doing is, we may have to have additional layers or additional, maybe it's double overreads of imaging things that are very critical. It's not just the one radiologist, but a second one if it's a critical result. Bucketing the outputs. I always think about this in imaging. It's like, okay, this image is stone cold normal. I probably don't have to worry about it. This group of images is, there's a mass in the breast. And then we got a little bit of gray zone. So focus in that gray zone are measures to ensure performance. Maybe we need two breast radiologists to read those mammograms in addition to the AI to decide whether it's true or false. But that may be okay because it's only 3% of the images or 1% of the images that we're having to do that for. So I think these risk-based strategies will become very important in order to allow us to feasibly keep a good handle on these things, especially as we're learning. And then, as you suggest, especially as both the data and the circumstances and the performance drift as they're bound to do.
Yeah, just to add to that is also it usually does not start with a dramatic failure, right? Like it starts with small signals that no one is watching closely enough. And so you see things like, there is a drift that goes unnoticed, outputs, that become harder to explain, or like, clinicians are, slowly but quietly, losing trust in the system. So sometimes teams, begin patching up either prompts or workflows instead of addressing the underlying data, right? So those early signals are, I would say, are governance problems, right? Like, so if organizations catch them early, they can correct course. But then if they ignore them, then we are looking at larger risks that can appear, right?
Thank you. So how do you high trust organizations like the one we work in healthcare? I mean, trust is You lose trust, especially you guys with your background as physicians, you lose everything. So how do you pick a workflow to focus on? Because one of the things you mentioned earlier in the conversation, Mark, was there is 1,000 pilots out there, and yeah, that might be a strategy, but and then you talked about a different model, which is we're not ready, or the technology is not ready to be deployed. So how do you pick a workflow that is aligned with the mission of your organization, that is going to be touching lives, which, as you mentioned, if you have an accident, you cut all your fingers, which is a visual that is troubling me now. And but also you want to bring some of the benefits that this technology can add, especially as margins keep shrinking and all stuff that we get challenged all the time. So how do leaders go about picking a workflow?
And this may be leaders, but I think it is clinical informaticians, IT professionals that need to be thinking about it at a first tier. And one of the things that Motive Medical Intelligence and I have worked on over the last year or so is a framework for thinking about what kinds of AI you use for what kinds of clinical problems, for exactly the reason you describe. I mean, there's cost reasons, there's and so on. But if you think about the issues, there's things like cost, explainability, which we talk a lot about with generative AI, and clearly our old rule-based systems highly explainable. For example, machine learning systems, yeah, maybe somewhat explainable. Generative AI, tough sometimes. And how explainable does it need to be? How reproducible? What levels, to your point about hallucinations, of error is tolerable? Because there's going to be error in all of these. And if you start to think about those things and think about the characteristics, so rule-based systems, highly explainable, pretty darn cheap to execute, and so on. But no good at all at turning unstructured data into structured data. But then there's machine learned models that do pretty well at that at a much lower cost, and maybe not quite as good a performance as an LLM might do, but the cost point's tenfold lower. And so you can start to think about, when you ask what workflow, I think in some ways you want to flip that around and start with the issue of what task are you trying. This goes back to what are your objectives of this strategic thing. We're trying to get our care managers to be able to make a 5% bigger difference in the ER follow-up visits by giving them better information, better guidance. And so we start with that task, and then we say, what kinds of AI, what kinds of tools can we employ given the constraints of that process? We don't want, we can't have autonomous decisions because they're clinical decisions, the care manager's license is on the line. Yeah, you want that done. You need an explainable recommendation, because nor the care manager, nor the patient, nor the primary care physician are going to like it when it's a black box, and so on. So I think you start with the task, and then you ask the question of what are the right kinds of AI to employ in the task, based on the attributes and the risk and the value of that particular portion. And our pipelines are going to vary, like if you think about quality measurement, for example, like how do you define which patients you're going to include? Certain age groups, things like that. You don't want a generative AI doing that because it's lousy at doing simple math, right? For a whole variety. And there's tricks you can play to make that better, but it's expensive. It's not great at math. It's pretty easy to have a rule that says if you're over 18 years of age, as of July 1st, that's not rocket science. So let's do that. It's explainable, it's fast, it's cheap, blah. Okay. But now you need to figure out what the patient's ejection fraction is. Well, it's buried in a PDF of the Echo report. Now maybe I need a machine learned model because it's going to give me higher performance at a reasonable cost and so on down the line, but now I need to take the guidelines, as Raajiv said, and turn those into computable quality measures so that I can employ them at scale and actually, measure that quality measure on 19 million people in 5 or 10 minutes instead of in 5 or 10 weeks because we've optimized the execution. I may want to use generative AI to create that query, to convert that guideline into CQL so that I can implement it at high performance. That's, rule-based systems are going to be hard to do that. So pick the right tool, but that whole pipeline might have all kinds of AI in order to get it done.
Thank
Yeah.
you for that.
Yeah, I think the use cases, I would say, are going to be the drivers overall, right? Because like Mark said, there are some use cases where auditability is, I mean, in healthcare, you've got to explain where you're getting your answers from, where are the sources. The provenance is a huge problem in healthcare. And if we are not able to showcase that, and even in some of the use cases that we have where we're talking about, moving the needle with physician behavior, when we present insights to physicians, they're going to ask, what's the credibility of this insight that you're providing me? What the scores that we are providing with them? And so that traceability, that trustability is something that has to happen for certain use cases. It's going to be very heavy. But if you're looking at some use cases where it's just a matter of transforming a data that's in a certain format in terms of interoperability, it's moving from one system to the other. You look at a data dictionary from one system, you're just going to apply something and then it's going to transform. That could be done pretty easily by an AI model because the systems are pretty clear there, and there is some tracking involved as well. But then also in terms of volume, right? There's a lot of organizations that have tons of data that are supplemental outside of their EHR sitting in their data repository. And then people are trying to see, can you do something with this data, drive some intelligence out of this? In terms of building some rule-based models that are going to take quite a bit of time trying to extract that knowledge out of it, AI can come in and do some preliminary summarizations. And so that initial process could be, hastened quite a bit. And then you add something to it and then make some, the intelligence much more validated and trustworthy, right? So it depends upon the use cases. And so I would say most of the use cases in healthcare require audit trails, tracking, explainability, like Mark said. So yeah, it's a matter of trying to understand which workflows and then decide on what tools are we planning to use for that.
Thank you. I guess it comes loud and clear. Just be aware of all the AI hype. This is not a general purpose tool. This is a tool that needs to be used in specific places, and it should be coexisting and co-integrated or co-working with other tools that we already have on the tools. So with that as a context, and I know we have a few more minutes before we depart. So what is one question you believe boards, trustees, senior executives are still not asking or are deferring to ask until it's too late? What is that question or questions that you think? And you brought one, which is the one that you just discussed now, which is, look, not a general purpose AI tool. This is very specific. Be mindful. Don't throw 1,000 pilots out there because it won't scale, organizational change, ROI. So you already gave us a lot to think about. So what else you think they're not asking that they should be asking?
Well, I guess one question I think boards are still not asking often enough is what knowledge and data infrastructure does AI actually depend on, and how well it is governed. Now, I mean, in healthcare, AI systems often, they are relying like I said, in large amounts of clinical guidelines, quality measures, policy logic that were never designed to be structured or mission readable, right? Like, so if that foundation is inconsistent or poorly governed, even a very advanced model can produce unreliable results. So the earlier boards ask about the underlying knowledge and the data infrastructure, the easier it is for them to scale AI very safely and reliably.
Thank you. Marc?
And my answer would be, as a senior leader, the question you need to be asking is, how is another firm going to disrupt us by becoming, I'll call it AI native?
Okay.
In other words, reinvent the work that we do today, starting with a blank page and leveraging the data, tools, and technologies that we have available today that will lead to a variety of business advantages in terms of agility, in terms of cost structure. And so people talk about the billion-dollar unicorn, right? A one-man unicorn. Because you don't need 100 developers to go do it today. You don't need necessarily the world's best measurement scientist today. You have a lot of that bundled into these frontier models, and it properly leveraged. So that is the risk that I think a lot of boards and senior leadership are not worrying about enough, is that reinvention of their business by somebody else who is aggressive. That's not to say you can, just stop everything you're doing and reinvent your business, but that's what's going to cause them to be up at night, is that alternative to how they have done it for the last 10 years. And maybe they were only around 10 years and you think they wouldn't be that stale. But in today's world and pace of innovation, 10 years is ancient technology.
Mm-hmm. These days, weeks, right? Things are changing.
That's how it feels.
So just one more question and then I'll let you guys wrap up. So where do you see the biggest gap between AI capability and institutional readiness these days? Are we ready as organizations in a highly regulated and structured industry where you see results right away? If that hallucinations happen in the wrong workflow, humans are going to basically suffer and the institution is going to suffer. So where do you see the biggest gap between AI capabilities today and organizational readiness?
Yeah, to me, I feel that the capability is moving very quickly, but the infrastructure and the governance that's needed to support it's still catching up. And AI is pretty amazing and impressive at retrieving evidence, synthesizing information, and even drafting early versions of computable logic. But many organizations still rely on manual processes and to maintain the clinical knowledge that those systems depend on. So I feel that the biggest gap today is, between how quickly AI capabilities are advancing and how slowly healthcare organizations can, update their governance and operational processes.
Thank you.
And somewhat related, I think, to me, the biggest gap is that they don't understand yet, and I think as a field, we don't understand it, in part because of what you described, that things are moving so quickly, where the boundaries or the limitations of these technologies are. They will perform amazingly on, as Raajiv said, on some spot things, and you think, oh, wow, this is phenomenal. But where are the boundaries? When does it fail? Is, as you said, a 0.1% failure rate tolerable? Understanding those is, I think, the biggest gap, because then we end up employing the wrong technology for the wrong solution, thinking that it's better than it is.
Excellent. Thank you. Final remarks, any message you want leaders to remember, to listen, to understand, to be mindful of?
Well, we've talked a lot about a lot of the limitations and negatives and so on. The thing I do think, though, especially senior leadership, the capabilities that these technologies will, with time, bring to innovation, the fact that we can do things with small teams in weeks that were years and large teams not long ago, allows for rapid cycle of testing, innovation, and evaluation at a scale we could never imagine before. And so I think our mindset can be transformed by this from these have to be big, thoughtful, ponderous projects to we can experiment and learn with discipline at a pace that we could never anticipate and never execute on previously. I think that's very exciting. And we can harvest the deep knowledge and insights that our employees have, that our consultants have, and it's going to be a very exciting decade.
Excellent. That's a very positive note to end. How about you, Raajiv? Any final message to?
Yeah, I think one of the things that to just touch upon the agility that Marc just mentioned is that it's to keep people have to just be open and be flexible, because there's going to be areas where their products are going to evolve, and and they're going to discover new areas. So things like where there's ambient AI being used at the point of interaction between a physician and a patient, and you're looking at areas where that can just evolve into just documentation. But then if people are just more open, you could see that product could just evolve into uh, modeling of terminologies that can come out of the documentation. It can then go into revenue cycle management. It can go to utilization management. So opening up and being very flexible in this environment is going to be the key, because we never know. It's only after we deploy something we can see the level with which we can step into other areas. So kind of not pigeonholing, but just being more open and trying to see where there could be potential areas of involvement is going to be a key aspect for leaders to think overall.
Excellent. Again, this was a very insightful conversation. I encourage our listeners to reach out directly. I'll leave their contact information there. And there's a lot of changes, a lot of good things we discuss here. And hopefully, as things do change, hopefully we'll have you back in the show in a few months, which I'm sure we're going to be talking about all kind of other challenges and opportunities that came up. So again, Marc and Raajiv, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
That was great.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of AI Governance with Dr. Freddie Seba. For more insights, be sure to subscribe and share with a friend or colleague on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube Podcasts. To learn more, visit freddieseba.com. Until next time.